Hi, I'm Joe Feeks, editor of Pig Health Today, and with me is Dr. Joe Connor. He is a veterinarian at Carthage Veterinary Service in Carthage, Illinois. Great to see you, Joe.
Likewise.
I know that you spent quite a bit of time in China, and African swine fever has been on everybody's minds, not just here in the United States, but even more so in Europe and Asia. We've really had to ratchet up our biosecurity and surveillance, haven't we?
Yeah, we absolutely have. And Joe, I think as we think about it and we think forward, we're likely going to look back and say that this is a virus that's shifted the global industry in a number of ways, all the way from do we have the right type of production systems, particularly in Asia, as you're aware, over the last 3 years where they've built quite large complexes, both on the breed, the wean, and the finishing side, but also as we rethink about how do we protect or increase the biosecurity, and as we think about the differences today compared to, say, 10 years ago. And as we think between those two time comparisons, we would say that a large part of our risk previously, so 10 to 20 years ago, would have been in actually animal movements or semen between countries. Today, we would say now, with the global industry, that risk is really shifted because we have technology to monitor or do surveillance on animal movements. But what we still lack, but are gaining considerable amount of technology, is how do we monitor the other inputs that come into the farms and into the U.S. as a whole. Specifically, if we think about African swine fever, from our lessons learned with PED, we now know and got a wake-up call that yes, we do move ingredients in a global industry. We do move different products, vitamins, trace minerals, antibiotics. We do move soft goods. We now have to determine how do we understand the safety and security of those inputs, and then what technology do we have to monitor the safety of those inputs before they get into our production systems.
And you mentioned PED, and as catastrophic as that was back in 2013, 2014, in some ways it was a blessing in disguise, wasn't it?
Well, it was a blessing in several different ways. One is, once we got past the short-term impact, we had quite high prices. And because it was a virus that affected the suckling pig and had only minimal impacts on the breeding herd, we could recover that production quite well. What it did open us up as a wake-up call was that we quickly understood or recognized how that virus was moving, that there had to be other methods of movement than what we traditionally think of, which would be aerosol, people, and that caused us to really refocus and really to look broader, and has now opened up a number of really high quality research projects that are going to drive the way we manage our inputs going forward.
So when you look at the experience with PED and you look at the ominous threat from African swine fever, how has that changed things for you and your fellow veterinarians at Carthage? What are you doing differently now?
Well, as we look at how can we mitigate risk, and it's been a transition with the research groups underneath Schick leading that direction of what I call now practical research, trying to understand what and how those viruses survive, and then what mitigant steps we can put in place. I think we've all addressed, to some extent, the biosecurity that we can control relatively easy. So that is how people and supplies enter the farms themselves, how pigs are transported out, how incoming stock, breeding stock, is sampled and isolated. Where we have to make more progress is that we still know we have areas of cross-contamination at collection points. So for us in the U.S., that's slaughter plants, and that's also cull sow movements. The third would be between the experience of PED and now looking at the experience of ASF in the Asian countries, we've got to figure out how to manage those feed ingredients and soft goods that would come in when they're manufactured in those endemic or active countries.
And what about diagnostics? I mean, I know there's been lots of improvements just within the last couple of years with population-based diagnostics. Is that going to play a bigger role?
Yeah, it absolutely is going to play a bigger role, and several things have likewise expanded outside of the PED experience, led by the SHIC and our extension that we have to have diagnostics ready and available for these foreign animal diseases or maybe other emerging diseases. And we've got to have, the laboratories have got to have the capability to ramp up that diagnostic sampling quite quickly. Along with that, through original work from Iowa State and others, the use of population-based sampling through oral fluids has dramatically changed the way we can sample populations, increasing the sensitivity and lowering the cost, which is a great situation to be in. We've also, as an arm coming out of that, has now routinely using processing fluids in the suckling pigs to surveil for the same type of concerns that we would have. That's a huge advantage that we have in the U.S. compared to what we have in many other countries where the diagnostics are not as developed, they're certainly not as reliable, and the turnaround time is much longer. If we think about it from our security standpoint, all of those points are critical and a short-term advantage that we have in terms of detecting new viruses or emerging viruses.
So there's a lot of technology, like we mentioned, the population-based diagnostics that are going to help. But certainly everybody needs to be on their toes these days. What are you doing at Carthage? How are your veterinarians approaching this? Like, what are you doing now that you weren't doing maybe 2 years ago when you're doing an on-farm visit?
Yeah, it's a good question, Joe. And what we continue to try to do is, one, keep the education and the methodology that we need to look at to prevent introduction in front of us and in front of our clients. And so we're continually asking them to have in place mitigation steps for ingredients coming in, inputs coming in. We're clearly doing more auditing of the processes that we touch, and we're clearly using our eyes much more to audit those processes rather than just questioning and asking, are we doing these procedures? One of the things I think we got re-educated with ourselves is that it's really about having eyes on the ground and matching up the written protocols with what they're actually doing, and also recognizing that we have labor turnover on the farms, and so we can have a meeting today and feel quite comfortable that the protocol, the message is understood, but maybe 2 months from now we've had labor turnover. So one of the things we're trying to do is also have education as a part of the immediate post-hiring process to at least touch those points that we believe are important to protect the herd. We're also focusing on educating the entire team rather than just the senior management within that team. I think we also have to recognize that it's really about any one of that team recognizing the security steps that are important and at least raising the flag and requesting more information rather than just bypassing and going forward.
Is there anything more that farms could be doing? I mean, you mentioned employee training and education and being really vigilant, but is there any 1 or 2 other things that you'd like to see your clients be doing more of right now?
Yeah, I think there's several things that we would say we need to push forward. One is we've got to continue to interact with our USDA parties in terms of what is the surveillance of goods that are coming in, and how do we improve that? And what is the surveillance of global passengers that are coming into the U.S., and is that part of the chain secure enough to protect us? The third thing would be that we've also got to be careful the producers don't forget that they are also part of this process, and so they shouldn't just rely on their veterinarian to help or put those steps in front. They themselves actually have to stay engaged and be certain that they're requiring the same protective procedures that we would talk about, whether that's ingredients coming in, trace minerals, vitamins, antibiotics, soft goods. We all want to be pushing in the same direction.
Pork production is not as simple as it used to be.
Well, it's still a lot more fun, yeah.